Welcome to Saturday Night at the Movies, the podcast that celebrates classic, cult, and current films and the people that made them, and many other aspects of pop culture. I'm your host, Steve Rubin. Our producer is Ben Shrewsbury, and our signature theme was composed by Greg Lehrhoff. Here it's always Saturday night, and our mission is to chronicle film and pop cultural history one memory at a time. Tonight, we commemorate one of the largest and bloodiest battles of World War II in Europe, the Battle of the Bulge, by discussing the films that have chronicled that horrific conflict in midwinter 1944, 80 years ago this week. Helping me review the Bulge filmography is my friend Steve Mitchell, filmmaker, film historian, screenwriter, and my partner on all those Kino Lorber World War II movie commentaries. And definitely check out his amazing documentary, King Cohen, about the life and times of indie maverick director Larry Cohen. And joining us is another good friend and my producing partner on Silent Night, a Battle of the Bulge movie, Major Rory Aylward. Rory is a retired Army officer, a combat veteran of the Afghan campaign, and has served as an historian and military technical advisor on dozens of film and television projects. Welcome, Steve. Welcome, Rory.
Hey,
Thank you,
Steve, good
Steve.
to see you.
Good to see
Good
you.
to be here.
Good to be anywhere these days.
There's that.
So I was thinking about where I first learned about the Battle of the Bulge. And I think what happened was I didn't read the book, but my dad brought a paperback home by John Toland called Battle, the Story of the Bulge. And I looked at it and it was pretty heavy reading for an 11-year-old. So I laid it aside. I think that same year I picked up Goldfinger, which was a little lighter reading. But I was keenly aware of World War II because of all the landmark books, and I was really interested in reading and learning about World War II. What about you, Steve?
Yeah, I think I read a lot of the same landmark books that you did. In fact, I think John Toland may have written a couple. But, my dad was in the war. He was a greatest generation vet. Luckily, he was mostly behind enemy lines, not behind enemy lines, behind the lines, working with the Army Air Corps. So his experience in the war was not as horrifying as many, so that was good. And my dad just was always interested in combat films and war films. We used to watch Combat, the TV series, together. That was a father and son bonding thing. So, because of my dad, he would always say, you should watch this, you should watch that. And a lot of times, he was always pointing me towards war pictures.
Sure. What about you, Rory?
Gosh, it's a toss up between the landmark books, John Toland, like the John Toland for kids,
Yes.
that I read when I was little, or probably the first thing I saw was Battleground. My dad was a huge old movie buff, and so on the weekends we would watch these old films. And my dad was one of those guys that like knew all the names of the extras, like anybody who was on contract with, any of these studios. My father go, oh yeah, that guy, and then he's in, he's in Citizen Kane. Or it's like, oh, okay, Dad. But yeah, that was probably the first thing I saw that was, and when you're little, you think it's still going on. So
Well,
Just as a
Battleground.
sidebar, I just wanted to mention, kicking off what Rory said, that my dad, for a guy who was not, I don't think the word fan was really a word back in the day when my dad went to the movies. He was a fan because he could not only knew the stars, but he knew the character actors as well, even to the point where there are certain film composers that he knew. And he wasn't really a musical guy, but he knew Eric Wolfgang Korngold, Daniel Dietroff, I think is, Franz Waxman, all of those guys. He was sort of a credits junkie, which I think I inherited that. But he could recognize certain composers just by hearing the notes without even seeing their name. So it's kind of baked into my DNA.
Oh, sure. Well, that's very sophisticated information for a dad at that time to have. On my side was my mom was really into, all of the actors and all of the actresses, not so much the directors or composers, but she knew names. And when I got on the Joker's Wild Game show, and I had a week between my appearances because the show broke for the weekend. I had a category called Clark Gable, and my mother literally went over. I got a list of all of Clark Gable's movies, and she went over each title with me because she had seen all of them. So, this is a quick aside. So, I'm on the Joker's Wild Game show. I'm losing. I have envisioning. I'm envisioning being humiliated on national television when I pulled back the handle and I got Joker, 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 which was an automatic win if you answered one question in any category. So, of course, I picked Clark Gable. In fact, I said on national TV, I said, and I closed my eyes, Clark Gable, if you ever did anything for me, do it now. So, the question was, in 1941, Clark Gable made a film with Lana Turner, the title of which sounds like a dance music hall. And I said, Honky Tonk? And I was right, and I won the game. And I would, in a million years, I would never have known of Honky Tonk. But Mom went over that title and said, oh, that's Lana Turner. Remember Lana Turner? So there you go. So
There you go.
Mom was a definite conduit to classic film stuff. Well, here for those of you who are watching this on YouTube, because we have a YouTube channel now, you can actually see the still I put up of Van Johnson and John Hodiak playing Privates Jarvis and Holly. And one thing I just loved about this movie, and I'm gonna show another picture of more of the cast because Battleground has a really nice cast. Here you can see some of them. George Murphy, who later became a U.S. Senator. And there's Holly on the left, Van Johnson, Hodiak, and there's Ricardo Montalban. And I guarantee you he's not sitting on Corinthian leather. And I love this. And this was one of the movies I researched for my first book, Combat Films, American Realism, 1945 and 1970. So the key to learning about Battleground is meeting Robert Pyrosh. And as we all know, Robert Pyrosh created the combat television series and wrote this Battleground movie. Robert was a U.S. Army infantry veteran with the 35th Infantry Division. He was actually part of the forces that were sent in to relieve Bastogne. And Battleground is about the siege of Bastogne. And for those of you who don't know your World War II history, it was defended by the 101st Airborne Division. I think about 18,000 guys arrived via truck as the Germans make the breakthrough. And the Battle of the Bulge is a battle, essentially, for those of you who aren't aware of it, was Hitler's last gasp in the West. He threw three armies into a gap in the American and British lines, defended by a small group of soldiers. Rory, you're more of an historian than we are. What can you tell us about the strategy behind Hitler's assault on the Western Front?
So the theory was if it was two objectives. One was to put a strain on the relationship between the Americans and the British to cause a rift with the Allies in hopes that they would sue for peace, and also to the attack was basically on the seam between the two armies to try and split them up and to reach the Meuse River and cause as much havoc as possible and maybe give Germany a bargaining chip in some sort of eventual peace process that was, in retrospect, seemingly unlikely to have ever happened. But you know, Hitler was not the guy who always bet on the reality that was in front of him. And as plans go, it was audacious. It was also very unlikely to succeed. A lot of his generals tried to talk him into the small solution, which was to just do a counterattack and maybe push the Allies back, but not try to go as far as the Meuse River in Belgium. But Hitler, you know, being a little pushy about things, insisted on this grand campaign, which the Germans went through the Ardennes in 1940 and had great success. But of course, they did that in good weather against an opponent that was not, you know, as prepared as the Allies were. The attack itself initially had success because it was a surprise, because it was a thinly defended area. But in strategic terms, it kind of gave at the expense of the guys who were at the brunt of the attack. It basically the Nazis created a salient in the lines, which is the Bulge, and then it was easier for the Allies to roll them up afterwards. So
Right.
you know,
It's interesting in some of the more recent books, Toland wrote books back in the 50s and 60s. In the more recent books, they talk about how the Germans underestimated our ability to meet the brunt of their attack. In fact, they did not predict that Patton could literally disengage in the south and move towards the Bastogne salient so quickly. And I think we'll talk a little bit about it later when we talk about the movie Patton. It's funny, and we'll talk about this movie later as well. We'll talk about Battle of the Bulge. But in Battle of the Bulge, when Werner Peters, Steve?
Yes.
When
Yeah.
Werner Peters is instructing Robert Shaw's Colonel Hessler character on what the objectives of the Battle of the Bulge are, he says, and he introduces the fact that the Germans are now flying operational jet fighters, Me-262s. They've got a new battle tank, and they predict that they'll split the American line, British lines, and it'll take them 18 months to recover. On what planet is he living on?
gotta wonder.
So Pyrosh, anyway, he was part of the relief forces for Battleground. But he was a working screenwriter in Hollywood before he even went off to war. He had actually wrote Marx Brothers movies. He was very established. So he comes back. He's working for Howard Hughes at RKO Studios, and he developed this movie, which later became Battleground, based on a lot of the notes he took about his experiences in the foxholes. And a lot of the experiences we see in Battleground are based on Robert's experiences in the war. And but Hughes didn't want to make the movie. I think he was more into the Air Force. He was all about those Hell's Angels type stories. So Battleground was brought over to the studio by Dory Sherry. Dory Sherry was an RKO executive, and then when he became head of production at MGM, he brought the project in, and it's become one of my favorite movies. Steve, what's your take on Battleground?
Well, it's interesting in that it's not really a very actionful picture. My recollection is there's one real major battle scene in the fog, which is really dramatically staged and very cinematic. And then there's a smaller sequence. It's mostly a character-based movie, and it's mostly about how these guys are getting through the winter and what they have to do to survive, Mother Nature, although the European version of Mother Nature. It's loaded with great actors, great snappy dialogue. It's moving in a lot of moments. The only it's interesting that the drawback for me is it's a totally studio based movie. In fact, almost all of it was shot indoors on sound stages, but it was done so artfully, and Paul Vogel's cinematography was so expert. It won an Oscar for black and white cinematography. That you get a real sense of you are there. Except, like I said, you don't. It's sort of like a big play to me. Whereas a lot of the other movies that we might talk about there's more real estate, not always enough weather, as we'll probably get to with the Battle of the Bulge, the Cinerama production. But if Battleground is on, chances are I'm going to stop channel surfing and just sit back and watch it and enjoy it.
Sure, sure. One thing, I don't have a picture of him up, but Marshall Thompson plays Jim Layton, he becomes a member of Van Johnson's squad. And it kind of reminded me a little bit of Saving Private Ryan, the character played by Jeremy Davies, the Upham character. In many ways, Saving Private Ryan is told through Upham's eyes because he's coming to this squad for the first time. Layton is a total neophyte, and they don't particularly care for him right away. I remember he enters the tent when they're in their rest area before the battle, and he keeps moving from cot to cot because they keep saying, "That's my cot, that's my cot, that's my cot." And I always liked that Marshall Thompson character. Marshall Thompson was kind of a good everyman character in a lot of
And age appropriate too for most GIs. I mean, in this movie compared to the rest of the cast, he seems to be very young when in point of fact the rest of the cast was a lot older than most GIs at the time. So in a sense, he really was representing the soldiers of the day, at least in terms of the naivete and his age, etc.
and then you have,
It,
yeah, go ahead, Rory.
it's interesting because you look at a lot of these guys and they look old, but then you find out that their actual ages are young. There's this correlation between the depression, growing up in the depression and not having anything, and then showing up and spending a couple of years in the war. And all these guys look like they're 40, but they're actually like 25 years old. There's a classic picture of an American tank sergeant. He's got the helmet and everything like that. He looks ancient. He's 25. It's fascinating.
Yeah, they had all perfected that. Was it the 100-yard stare or
Yeah,
1,000-yard stare?
1,000 yard stare. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yard stare. Well, one of the actors, I have him up here for those who can see this, is James Whitmore's Sergeant Kinney character, who early in the story develops, I guess, frostbite on his feet. So
Yeah.
he kind of he's shuffling along, biting into his cigar. He's a real character, and he was nominated for Best Supporting Actor that year for an Oscar, but ended up losing to Dean Jagger, who won the Oscar that year for 12 O'Clock High, and so deservedly so.
It was a career-making part, I think, for Whitmore. It really put him on the map.
Yes, exactly. And
And
the movie won an Oscar also for Mr. Pyrosh's screenplay. And I think he really enjoyed the process. To research the script, he actually went back to Belgium in 47. So this is 2 years after the war has ended. And interestingly, walking around rural Belgium near Bastogne, he found his original foxhole.
wow.
Just
It
crazy.
hadn't filled. It hadn't filled in yet.
It hadn't filled in yet. It was just, it was still kind of partially open, and he remembered all of the guys that came rushing back. It was one of those, I don't know if you'd call it post-traumatic stress disorder, but he certainly had very strong memories of
Yeah.
characters. And they would later influence his next major screenplay, although it's 13 years later. He did, I should say, next World War II screenplay, which was Hell is for Heroes, which technically is not a Bulge film, although you get the impression. Actually, what Bob told me is he comes back from the war and he's in a gas station in Los Angeles, and a guy walks up to him and sees his 35th Infantry Division emblem or pin on his lapel, and says that when you guys moved out to attack the Bulge because Patton pivoted, my unit came in to basically take over your lines. We didn't have enough men, so we were very stretched, very thin, and that, of course, becomes the plot of Hell is for
Interesting.
Heroes. And Steve and I,
Listen,
of course, got to know Bob very well because we developed a TV, started as a TV movie, later became a feature movie on combat, which to this
right.
day is one of my all-time favorite TV shows.
It's one thing
Holds
I
up.
think. I think one thing that
What did you say, Steve? I'm sorry.
No, I just said it still holds up.
Still holds up. Go ahead, Rory. I'm sorry.
the one thing I think that Battleground does better than the other Bulge projects until you get to like Band of Brothers is it shows how cold it was. And I don't think most people appreciate that it was like the coldest winter in Europe in 50 years. And that most of the American soldiers, there was this decision to be made in higher headquarters. Do we push gas and ammo forward, or do we push the snowpacks and the winter clothes? And they wanted to end the war. They thought they could. So they emphasized moving supplies up that they thought would end the combat. And instead, they end up in this major winter battle in the worst winter in 50 years. And guys are wearing their regular combat boots and their regular field jackets. So the way the guys are bundled up and the way they look like they're just miserable all the time, I think is one of the better depictions of what combat in Belgium in 1944 must have been like.
I heard that I think my father-in-law, who was a combat engineer in that area, said that infantry soldiers would often stuff newspapers down their
Yeah.
pants as some kind of way of preventing it getting too cold. It's just, it's one thing to go on a camping trip and freeze your butt off. It's another thing to go into combat where you actually have to fight the enemy when you're freezing to death. I don't know how they did it. I really don't know.
When you mentioned Kinney and frostbite, a lot of guys had trench foot, which is a form of it's like frostbite, except it's just from having your feet wet and cold all the time. And they would just your feet would start to rot. And you'd feel these guys with like burlap wrapped around their shoes. They were in cold, freezing water all the time. And there's no way to get out of it. You light a fire, you get killed. So yeah, it was awful.
And it's an occasion when somebody yells out, "Hot chow." In fact, in the movie, at the end of the movie, somebody's yelling at this anti-aircraft crew, and the guy says, "Hot chow," and the guy says, "You aren't even warm." So let's move on. Okay, so actually, I should mention the fact that there was kind of a bit of a moratorium on World War II movies after 1946. There were 2 or 3 years where Hollywood kind of made an effort to avoid what they had been doing a lot of for the war years, which was making war movies. So Battleground was actually part of the big revival in '49, which included The Sands of Iwo Jima, 12 O'Clock High, and that definitely re kind of rejuvenated the war film genre, and it catapulted it forward, and they've been making thousands of World War II films ever since. I mentioned that Hell is for Heroes was his next World War II movie, but actually Pyrosh wrote the movie Go for Broke, which was about the 442nd.
Didn't he direct that as well?
I think you're right. I think he also directed that 442nd, the Nice Battalion in Italy. But in terms of just chronological order, I want to mention a movie that I actually renewed my awareness of today. I put it on Prime, which is Attack. And I'll tell you, Attack is not your typical warm and fuzzy World War II movie from the '40s. This is 1956, so this is 7 years after Battleground. And I joke warm and fuzzy. World War II movies aren't warm and fuzzy, but they have a certain positive, good old-fashioned patriotic spirit about that. And Attack is not the typical World War II movie. What's your overview on Attack, Steve?
Well, for starters, it's a Robert Aldrich movie, so it was made through his filters. Um, I remember once I used to work with a guy, and we were talking about what do you think is the greatest war movie ever made? And he said Attack. Now, this was probably back in the late '70s or early '80s. And I have very mixed emotions about Attack. On the one hand, I think it has an intensity to it, which I think there's a lot of shock value built into it. It is anti-heroic in many ways. It's a story about cowardice. Jack Palance seems to be, almost in a different movie than the rest of the cast, because the rest of the cast, there is some of that camaraderie that you're talking about. But as powerful as it can be, it suffers from a number of things to me. One, it was based on a play, and you can sort of feel that, especially in the third act. Secondly, it's supposed to be Battle of the Bulge, but it was shot out probably, I think, in Thousand Oaks or something like that. And you have that. One of the things that was so brilliant about Battleground is Paul Vogel and the effects guys and the set guys at MGM created that sense of cold, gray, foggy light. Well, Attack is shot in bright California sunlight. So it never feels cold. And they sort of, tip the hat to where they are, where the actors are wearing heavier clothes, but there's no sense of breath. There's no sense of there's not, they have those like salt patches to indicate some melted snow here and there, but it never really feels like the Bulge. And I think when I reminded you of it, you said, oh yeah, Attack was a Bulge movie, because it doesn't feel like it. I think the battle sequences are alternately sort of good and not terribly well staged. It has one of the dopiest looking American tanks as a German tank I've ever seen. But the acting's really good. Lee Marvin's great. Eddie Albert is fantastic. Palance is just his usual intense self. It's real mix and match for me, but it's worth seeing because it's kind of an experience, for the viewer. And if you've never seen it, it's raw,
Yeah.
but I think it doesn't completely work from time to time.
Rory, you have some thoughts on Attack? Do you know Attack?
Yeah, I mean, it's one of the great things about Attack is that Eddie Arnold was in fact a war hero.
Eddie,
Um, Eddie Albert, I'm sorry. But he's like an actual war hero. To see him playing a coward so convincingly, it
this
is,
is a guy who, according to the thing I read, saved 50 Marines on
yeah,
Taqwa
yeah.
by driving his landing craft up and saving. Yeah, he was a hero. Eddie Albert's one of my all-time favorite actors. He he def he's a character you love to hate in this movie. Oh my God.
Yeah, yeah. And I think there's one of my favorite memoirs about the war is a book called Roll Me Over by Raymond Gantner. Um, and it's an interesting memoir because he's not a kid. He's 30 years old. He's married. He's got two kids. He's a radio station manager. He's got a degree from Syracuse University. And he decides that after three deferments, he should go to the war. And he ends up in the 1st Infantry Division right on the eve of the Battle of the Bulge as a replacement. And he writes this book, which to Steve's point is not a lot of combat happens. When it does, it's very intense. But I mean, there's a lot of just being miserable. There's a lot of just like, just stuff going on that has nothing to do with the war. And he talks about the fact that there's the greatest generation, the people we all, revere and look up to. And he said, not a few of them were jerks. Not a few of them were cowards. Not a few of them were like not people you'd want to spend time with. And he's like this, he's an educated guy, and he's like listening to these conversations, thinking, "You guys are idiots." And he mentions at one point, he talks about this guy that you hate, that you just hate everything about him, will do something so heroic and beautiful in combat, and you're just like, man, that's. And then he goes back to being a jerk, and it was just there's a very human quality to the book of a guy trying to reconcile all these things that are happening. So
Steve, do you remember that episode of Combat about the guy that everybody hates?
Oh yeah, that's amongst combat fans, that's a famous episode. It's called The Glory Among Men. And I think it was the last episode of the second season, and they let Vic Morrow direct it. And it's what they used to call in television a bottle show, meaning it takes place essentially in one location. I think they had one interior set, and then they had one location on the back lot at MGM, which was very carefully art directed. It almost had kind of a nightmarish quality. And so the guy everybody hated was stuck. He was wounded, and he was stuck kind of in this no man's land between the squad and a German machine gun emplacement. And they all hated him. They said, "Let him go. Come on, let's get out of here. We can't." And they can't do it. And I think one of the things that I found moving, well, I watch Vic Morrow on that show, and he's almost always moving. He was brilliant. And they're all standing around after they've saved this guy. And Vic Morrow, the sage sergeant, looks around and says, "You all know why we did this." And they didn't say anything. They're just all kind of, they know he was one of their guys, and they couldn't throw him, well, not under the tank, but throw him on a tree in the line of fire. And it resonates really a lot for me because it was so simple. The plot was so simple but so human, and I think all the best war movies tap into the humanness. As a kids, I think we're watching it for. As somebody once called my fondness for action sequences gun music. My wife sometimes you hear me watching an old combat episode, and she'd hear that that jackhammer German belt fed it's not an MP40, is it? No,
The MG-34 is the
MG-34 and the MP-40s were the Schmeisers, and she would go, "Up, he's watching combat." And as a kid, you like seeing running and jumping and shooting and stuff, but the best episodes of combat were the most human, and I think that applies to all war movies.
Addressing what you said about how awful the tanks look like, I read that this was Attack was one movie that the Department of Defense refused to cooperate with. They didn't like the
Makes
script.
sense.
Yeah, they didn't like the way it depicted the army. For those of you who don't know the movie, it essentially is about a tough sergeant played actually is Jack Palance.
Lieutenant.
He's a lieutenant. He's a lieutenant. He's a platoon commander. His company commanders, played by Eddie Albert, just will not support him. He's very cowardly, and he's lost lots of men because of Eddie Albert's character's cowardice. And he just keeps on. This keeps on building to such an intensity in the movie, and I found it just very, very compelling. So they didn't get any military cooperation. So you don't see the kind of hardware you would see in a movie that was getting
Yeah.
cooperation.
Cowardly and ambitious too, which I thought was
yeah.
interesting. That he wasn't just a coward afraid of being there. He was trying to use the war for his own post-war plans.
Yeah.
And Lee Marvin, strangely enough, was playing this officer that he was sucking up to. Now, Lee Marvin usually played, enlisted men or sergeants and stuff like that. And it wasn't until later in his career where the hair got sort of silver, not unlike mine, and he's playing characters with rank. But it's a powerful movie, although like I said, it's got its shortcomings in my eyes.
Well,
I,
Aldrich.
I had
Oh,
I had a moment I went to the infantry school at Fort Benning when I enlisted in the Army. And there was one guy in my platoon who was just a weirdo, just a nutcase. And goes through the whole program with us. And I had to go to the hospital one day, and the drill sergeant wasn't much older than me. So we actually were having like a conversation like people. And I said, I got to ask you, like, why is he still here? He said, well, it's a funny thing. He says, had a couple of guys who were like, they were like football players, and they were like all rah rah and ready to go. And he says, shooting starts, we don't know what happens. He said, this guy, the nut guy, he could win the Medal of Honor. We just don't know. So as long as he like completes the course, we send him out and we see what happens. Like, okay, sure.
so we're going to move on to another movie that probably isn't as well known as well, but I remember it from going to those kiddie matinees, although this is hardly kiddie matinee fodder, which was I think it's 57's The Last Blitzkrieg. Now, we talked about earlier Van Johnson playing the lead in Battleground, playing, I guess he's Private Holly. Maybe he's a corporal and a good guy. In The Last Blitzkrieg, he's the son of a German general. And this was an interesting aspect of the Battle of the Bulge that I learned later, was that part of the campaign the Germans were foisting upon the Americans was a campaign to infiltrate our lines with German soldiers dressed in GI uniforms, which in reality was a complete bust because they didn't speak very well, and most of them were captured and I think immediately executed as spies. But in this case, Johnson is part of, I guess that was what was the German commando guy who organized it?
Scorzani.
Scorzani, Otto Scorzani, who I think had earlier done the daring rescue of Mussolini
Mm-hmm.
from Italy. So he had a great reputation as not the Nazis' audacious commando leader. So in this case, Kerwin Matthews, who I was about to see play the lead in Seventh Voyage of Sinbad, playing a totally good part, plays a fanatical Nazi in this movie. And it was all shot in Holland, interestingly. The good guy is Dick York, who we later discover on the Bewitched television series, playing Darren Stevens. What do you remember about The Last Blitzkrieg, Steve?
I don't remember a whole lot. I saw it again, like in the last couple of years, maybe during COVID. I think I found it on YouTube or something like that. And it was one of two war pictures that Van Johnson did. The other one was The Enemy General. And I think the one thing about these movies that were a real plus is well, Blitzkrieg was shot in Holland and The Enemy General was shot in France. So the real estate was authentic real estate. It wasn't, Thousand Oaks or the back lot trying to imitate Europe. It felt like Europe. And, even if you don't know the actual real estate itself, as an audience, authenticity is something that you can feel even if you don't know. Now, a lot of war movies before Saving Private Ryan and certainly Band of Brothers would get away with, uh, the weapons and the equipment were not always authentic or not always complete. And the last Blitzkrieg sort of felt authentic, but dramatically, I thought it was kind of so-so. But Van Johnson was in Battleground. Van Johnson was in Go for Broke. He was in this. He was in The Enemy General. So for some reason, Van Johnson, who was really beforehand, and he was also in 30 Seconds Over Tokyo, he's kind of a song and dance guy. He was a light comedy guy. He was not an intense war guy, but yet he sort of became a go-to war movie actor. And I'm sure Columbia was saying, well, the audience knows Van Johnson from Battleground. They'll go see this. It's okay. It's of mild interest, at least to me, and I'm a war movie fan.
It's funny, I have a still, a behind the scenes still, takes place in front of MGM Studios in 48 or 49, and it has the whole cast of Battleground, but Van Johnson is missing, and Robert Taylor is there very much in the foreground. I think Robert Taylor may have been the original Holly and got replaced by Van Johnson, which I think is
Hmm.
an interesting case. I don't know what was going on with the casting there, but
I mean, MGM didn't make a lot of war movies, but they did Bataan, and Robert Taylor was in that.
right.
And so maybe perhaps for publicity reasons, the idea saying, well, here's a guy from another war movie we made. I mean, who knows? I'd love to find out if he was originally cast in Battleground.
Yeah, no, no. I think I tried to track it down at one point. I didn't get much further. I should point out, and I didn't actually think of this until now. Let me ask you a trivia question. Do you either of you guys remember a service comedy set during the Bulge?
Yes, with Glenn Ford and Red Buttons, and I think her name is
Tina Elg.
Imitation General.
Exactly.
Oh, and Tina Elg was the female lead. Again,
Exactly.
that's one of those movies that was shot like out in Thousand Oaks or something like that, not too far from the ocean.
By
Trying
the way,
to,
when I was
but it's
watching,
not bad actually.
no, it's not bad. I was watching Attack today, and it looked like the same terrain that Vic Morrow shot his two-part "Hills Are for Heroes" episode. Looked the very
Yeah,
same. Yeah, Imitation General is actually it would be called today a dramedy. It has Red Buttons, who's the comic relief, of course, and it has some good action in it,
yeah,
actually.
it's a little silly from time to time, but
Sure.
the battle stuff and the action stuff was not bad at all. It's worth catching, and I'm sure because it's an MGM picture, it shows up on TCM every once in a while.
Yeah, yeah. I actually the theme music is kind of fun too. Now here's a movie that probably has been somewhat forgotten by most people, and it's from 1961, so 3 years later, Armored Command. And although it's technically it is kind of a bulge picture. It refers to a part of the same offensive period. Rory, was there
Yeah.
something going on, kind of a diversionary German thing going on that spawned this? Do you remember?
I mean, there were supporting attacks further in France, but nothing compared to the big show.
Right, because
Uh,
I think this is supposedly taking place in the Vosges Mountains,
yeah,
and it's Operation North Wind, I believe, which is
that's
a German
yeah.
campaign to the north of the Bulge salient. And basically, this involves a very young Burt Reynolds and Earl Holliman and their squad, and they find a woman who is badly wounded lying in the snow. And it turns out that's Tina Louise, who we all know from Gilligan's Island. She was Ginger, but she's very un-Ginger-like in this movie. Steve, can you tell a little bit about the plot that you remember?
Well, I don't remember much of the plot. It's been a while since I've seen it, but for a movie that's called Armored Command, there's not a lot of armor. Well, there is a fair amount of armor in the climax,
Right.
but there's not a lot of battle stuff. There's a lot of more wondering what the story is with Tina Louise, and Tina Louise is kind of trying to maybe romance some information that she's going to return to her superiors about what's going on. Burt Reynolds is playing an totally unlikable uh, sort of punk street kid, but you can tell that he's got something. I'm not quite sure how to describe it. I don't know if his star quality was coming through, but I think the camera's going, there's something going on with this guy.
I think it's
And
called machismo.
well, he had that. And Earl Holliman's good in it, and it starred, of all people, Howard Keel, who was one of the major MGM song and dance guys, as I guess the company commander. Warner Anderson was also in it. He, was fresh off, I guess you could say, the success of the Lineup TV show. And Warner Anderson was also in Objective Burma. And I suspect that he, like many of his fellow actors, smoked and drank, because in the 10 years or so after, or 12 years or so after, he looked like he had aged 20 some odd years. And I think that happened a lot with a bunch of the stars. It's got real weather, which is great. It was shot in Europe. Again, you feel that. When everybody's running around through, puddles and stuff like that, as to your point earlier, Rory, about, just trying to, stay warm and stay dry. Even making this movie, I think for some of the actors might have been a challenge in that regard. It's got a score by a guy named, I think, Bert Grund, who is a German composer. It's sort of weird because it's an American production, but it feels very Euro, which I guess for the material is good.
Yeah, it's Earl Holliman actually falls in love with the Tina Louise character, and of course, the fact that she's a German spy does not go well for their relationship. I literally have not seen this movie in 40 years, so I do remember the music though. So it obviously had a compelling score for me.
And I think what we're not talking about that really is the elephant in the room, Steve, is that MGM missed a golden opportunity with the kind of talent that they had to make the Battle of the Bulge musical that guys like the three of us really wanted to see.
I can't wait to hear that score. So obviously, no one had done the big Battle of the Bulge movie up until then. I mean, Battleground certainly had some size to it, but it was mostly on sound stages. So basically, what happens is we're waiting for the biggest battle, the battle film of all, which is the Battle of the Bulge. And I actually have to find the picture because obviously it's not here for a second. So bear with me, because this was shot in Cinerama. So not only was it not only
Actually, it was shot in Ultra Panavision, I
Ultra
believe,
Panavision. Okay, there.
and it was a Cinerama feature.
Okay,
But I think when it was shown, it was, Cinerama used to be three different cameras
right, right.
projecting three pieces of film joined together, which gave you this extraordinary widescreen effect. But this was done in one camera, but with an ultra widescreen aspect ratio. And if I really knew my stuff, I could tell you, but maybe it was 239 to 1, but I think it was even more than that. But it
Huh.
was the Cinerama release back in the day, reserved seats. It was a version of Roadshow.
Huh.
Um, and I think of all of these Bulge movies, it's my favorite, in spite of the fact, and every fan of this movie says this, it is so not historically authentic. And of course, the climactic tank battle, the big giant tank battle, is shot somewhere in Spain, and there's no snow, but there's a lot of dust. So it doesn't look wintry at all, even though in the beginning of the picture, they were in a part of Spain I think the story went that it was a part of Spain where there was always a lot of snow, except that year it was the warmest winter ever, and they didn't have a lot of snow. But
We're talking about the era of epic World War II movies. You know,
oh yeah, well, big
you know,
was a thing because they wanted to get people away from from the TV set in the theater.
right. So you've had The Longest Day, you've had The Guns of Navarone, you had The Great Escape, you've had The Train. It was time to do the Bulge on a big canvas, and it's
And
interesting.
in color too,
I'm sorry.
and in color, because I
Right.
don't think any Bulge story had been told had been shot in
Right,
color.
exactly. And I spoke to the producer, and I asked him because what was cool about The Longest Day, and a little bit later with Bridge Too Far in the 70s, was kind of the docudrama approach where you actually showed the actual places where each of the battles took place. I thought it was ultimately done well in The Longest Day because you knew exactly where they were, whether they're at Westerham on the coast or they were on Omaha Beach. And he decided not to do that. He decided that they would do a different tack. And I thought that it's a very serious movie. I think the casting was really well done. Casting Robert Shaw as a German Panzer commander, I thought was brilliant casting.
Uh, he's really the star of the show, even though he's quote the bad guy. Um, Robert Shaw was fresh in our minds as Red Grant from Russia with Love, and here he is playing this obsessive warrior who, for him, all that mattered was staying in combat and continuing to fight. For him, being able to fight was the fuel that literally propelled him. And it's a tremendous performance. It's really well written too. And yeah, I mean, I think in many ways it might be his best overall performance because he has to carry the movie in a sense. Henry Fonda is his opponent, and Henry Fonda is quietly great as usual and an interesting foil, although way too old. In fact, I think his hairpiece was dyed. So they were trying to make him look younger. In fact, all the officers in that movie are way too old.
It's
But
funny that once again, Dana Andrews is cast as a kind of not a really positive character. It's almost the same character he plays as a Navy admiral and in harm's way. He's a guy who just doesn't believe in any of the intelligence they're learning. And Henry Fonda, being an ex-police detective, is trying to convince the powers that be that the Germans aren't as defeated as they like. I like the way the movie opens
well,
with
and Robert Ryan literally playing virtually the same character he played in every war movie in the 60s. He's a general in Anzio, he's a general in this, he was a general in The Longest Day. It's just they said don't waste time, just give Robert Ryan the deal and let's move on with the casting. So there's almost like a stock company quality to some of these guys in
oh
these movies.
yeah, yeah, and also there are a lot of subplots in Battle of the Bulge. One of the characters I thought that was interesting. I'm going to pull up a picture real quickly here. Um, is young James MacArthur, of course we know from Hawaii Five-0, and there he is with George Montgomery as the grizzled veteran sergeant. MacArthur plays the young lieutenant, really wet behind. He's kind of one of those 90-day wonder types. And he learned, I think it's his coming of age in the movie because he learns the value of not surrendering because he becomes part of the Malmedy massacre. And Battle of the Bulge is the first movie that I think I had seen, which mentioned the fact that American GIs were mowed down by the Germans in what was the infamous Malmedy massacre. So, Rory, you have
I'll jump in first since we're um, the other thing, the thing that's nice about that movie is that in spite of the fact that it's not realistic, it is sort of dramatic in a very human way, and it touches on a lot of themes you would find in war movies. Like MacArthur learned how to be an officer. He learned about responsibility. He understood command. And George Montgomery is sort of his mentor. And he always sort of says lieutenant. Partly mocking his officer. But the flip side is he has this great moment. He says, "It's my job to take care of you." That's a nice moment. Telly Savalas is playing sort of a version of every Telly Savalas part that he played in the '60s, but he's really good. He's very moving in part of it, and also the guy who plays Conrad, basically Robert Shaw's valet, and I'm ashamed of myself. I can't remember.
Isn't that
Hans Christian Black.
Black?
Yeah,
Yes,
he's because he's a real German actor. He has real. There's an authenticity, and he's talking about where Robert Shaw saying, "Well, we can continue to fight," and Hans Christian Black says, "Well, what about my sons?" Robert Shaw is saying, "Well, they will become German soldiers," and everything like that. And Hans Christian Black is sort of the personification of the German soldier who knew the war was coming to an end. And so there are nice moments there as well. And I find it's a very enjoyable movie. I love the score, but I just know it's just kind of a load historically.
Hans Christian Black forgets to turn off the engine on their little command car at the beginning of the movie, and Shaw comes over and tells him, "I told you this before, petrol is blood." And the scene where he discovers that all his tank commanders are, as he says, boys, but then they all start singing the German Panzer don, 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 don. Anyway, I won't sing. But it's very powerful. Big screen war picture in color, what's not to like? Oh, we forgot to mention Ty Hardin as one of those Otto Skorzeny Germans in American uniform guys, who's very effective.
He had left America. He was a TV star. He was in Bronco, probably best known in the early '60s, which is one of those 7,000 Warner Brothers TV westerns that seemed to be on ABC. And he wound up going to Spain and Europe, and he kind of became an expat. He became an American actor who would appear sometimes in foreign productions as the American actor. Some American TV actors did a lot of that in the '60s, especially with spaghetti westerns and some of the other action genres. He's really good. And Charles Bronson's in it, for crying out loud, and he's great in it.
He's great.
That was, I think, one of those movies that, people forget that Bronson was this, is ubiquitous the right word? I hope it is.
Yeah.
Actors who played were in these action films, and he was support in a lot of great movies like, Magnificent Seven, Great Escape, this picture, of course, The Dirty Dozen. And it were these movies that he did where he was kind of like the second or third character lead, helped him get lead parts in European pictures, and where he became a big star. But even my mom knew who Charles Bronson was in his character days. She said, "He's so ugly, he's gorgeous."
Well, we can. I have to say that one movie that isn't about the Battle of the Bulge, but features a Battle of the Bulge sequence is, of course, Patton. And Patton, to me, is one of the great movies of all time. Best Picture of 1970. But just for my money, aside from the fact that they didn't have real American tanks, it was, they didn't have vintage American tanks. It's a flawless movie, and they have a pretty effective Battle of the Bulge sequence. Rory, remember those moments?
Oh, absolutely. Patton is an extremely well-made and very grounded in history film. The people involved in it were, some of them had been there, some of them, they just all cared about it a lot. And the script is the script is extremely faithful to history. It moves some things around. It makes the usual accommodations, but it is the thing I love the most about Patton is that back in 1969 people would come out of the theater and it validated whatever your views were. Like if you were a hawk, Patton seemed like the greatest thing ever, and if you were a dove, Patton seemed like a lunatic. So everybody walked out thinking Yeah, I'm right. But
That lunacy was kind of what dissuaded most of Hollywood's top actor echelons from
yeah,
taking the role. What the critical factor in that movie's success was getting Francis Ford Coppola to write the first draft.
yeah.
He was later joined by Edmund North, one of my favorite writers of all time, who of course wrote The Day the Earth Stood Still and I think Sink the Bismarck. Um, and he just they just did a great job. And I actually, when I was at UCLA as a student, um, I worked for James Webb, who was a renowned screenwriter in Hollywood. Worked on a lot of historical films. He wrote Pork Chop Hill, Vera Cruz, The Big Country, the Charge at Feather River in 3D. But he was known for history. And when the project was originally going to be a Willie Wyler film, Webb was brought in to do the first story. And Webb's interesting thing was that he had been under the command of Lloyd Friedendahl in North Africa, the general who commanded the army before Patton came in. So he brought a historical perspective, but nobody would appear in his script. It was way too historical, and they felt it was a glorification. But it was the
Oh,
Coppola draft, as you recall, the opening scene in Patton. He stands up in front of all those troops and says,
right.
"No bastard ever won a war by dying for his country. He won it by making the other the poor dumb bastard die for his country." So yeah,
Based on a real speech.
real
So,
speech, exactly.
Well, the other trick that Patton pulls off is I have a saying, most people I know have heard me say it endless times and want to throw things at me, is the most special effect of all for audiences is character, character, character. And Patton, as written and as portrayed by Scott, is one of the truly great movie characters. I mean, I watched Patton recently at the American Cinematheque in Hollywood in glorious 70 millimeter. I think it had a dimension 150, I think was the process it was filmed in. So it was great to see it big. And I think there were a lot of people who liked the movie there. And I think maybe quite a few people had never seen it.
hmm.
And people forget how funny it is. It's hysterically funny. He is hysterically funny because he
Yeah,
is just this. Well, one, he's so confident, and confidence is an
yeah,
appealing quality, but he's also so contradictory, you know. And but in a nutshell, he says during the course of the movie every aspect of what war is all about. At one point he says nothing is glorified, nothing is reaffirmed. Just because if you don't have that, well, then it's just horror. Then
yeah,
it's just death. And so that his whole attitude towards war encompassed all of it. It's to your point, Rory. Like if you're a hawk, you say, yeah. If you're a dove, you say, yeah, because he's the whole mosaic of war in one person, which just makes it makes him so perfect for a cinematic biography. Also, the other thing about Patton is this: that movie, I think, is in the vicinity of 3 hours. It's
yeah,
the shortest 3 hours you're ever going to watch.
yeah.
Whereas you can watch Last Blitzkrieg, I think, which is about 80 minutes, and you're just going, oh, please start shooting some guns. Please,
Is
please.
it?
My favorite moment is in regards to the Battle of the Bulge. They're in the big meeting of all the generals talking about what they can do, and of course they ask Montgomery, "What can you do?" And his second in command says, "Well, not for several weeks." And then they look down at the end of the table to George Patton and say, "George, can you help? I can attack with 3 divisions in 48 hours."
Right.
And that was just pure
Yeah.
Patton.
One other thing, and just in terms of connective tissue, that they shot pretty much all of Patton in Spain, except for I think the British stuff, the stuff in England. And they went to that area of Spain in the mountains where there's supposed to be lots of snow. And in the case of Patton, they had plenty of snow because the winter stuff, there's tons of
Right.
snow. And the other thing that's nice about it is, again, you're seeing characters and they, got the breath because it was cold and everything like that. So Patton actually got the thing that the producers for Battle of the Bulge were praying for.
Yeah,
They had the bad weather.
I think Milton Sperling was that was the name of the producer of Battle of the Bulge. He was the one who says that I, I wish I had that snow because it just impacted. Well, our final discussion is going to be on a movie that Rory and I got a chance to produce, which you've seen, Steve, which is called
Yeah.
Violent Night. And for those of you in the audience who don't know what this film is, Linda Hamilton plays a German woman named Erna Winken, who, with her son, were treated from the city of Aachen, which was under heavy bombardment, to a cabin in the woods. And on Christmas Eve night, 1944, she was visited by both German and American combat troops. And through her will and her forcefulness and her just true courage, she convinced the soldiers to keep their weapons outside, and they broke bread together, sang songs together, and shockingly left as friends in the morning. And we were fortunate to sell the project to Hallmark. A gentleman had come in. I think our friend was German, I think, as I
Yeah,
recall,
yeah.
and he had pitched it, but he wasn't sure it was a true story. But we did a little research, and it turned out Unsolved Mysteries had featured it as a reunion story where the little boy who had grown up to become a very successful baker in Hawaii had a reunion with one of the American soldiers. So then we realized it was a true story, and that's when Hallmark bought it, and we shot it up in Montreal in the winter of 2000.
Oh, we
Actually,
shot in
we
the
shot in the
summer.
summer of 2002. It was supposed to be winter, and we actually in the snow capital of North America, we had to make snow.
We spent like 9% of the budget on fake snow for
Well, very
for
convincingly.
yeah. I
Yeah,
mean,
yeah.
it was a like a well, it must have been like a half of an acre, and we spent all this money just making that 1/2 acre, the cabin exterior, look like it was, it had just snowed.
And
So
it's funny because you see these big dump trucks coming down the road carrying these giant blocks of ice, which are then thrown into some kind of crusher, and they have hoses, and they can just squirt that snow right on the ground, which is amazing. And then they had something called snow biz, which are these giant plastic bags full of biodegradable snowflakes, and then they put the wind machines out, and then we're suddenly in a snowstorm. It's pretty amazing, and it's 100 degrees or 90 degrees out.
yeah.
But one of my favorite moments in the whole movie is we rented a Sherman tank, a real Sherman, and we partially submerged it in mud because it's been knocked out. And we had to place that perfectly. It was our contribution to the production design. And Rory and I have a nice photograph in front of that tank. It was a wonderful experience, and Rodney Gibbons was our director. He was nominated for a Genie, the Canadian equivalent of our Emmys, and we got three other nominations, so a total of four nominations for the film. And it was quite well respected, and has become a bit of an evergreen. It pops up. I think where's it showing these days, Rory? It's like on YouTube.
Yeah, I think you can find it on YouTube. I think it might be somewhere on Prime. I mean, it might be on the Hallmark Channel.
You can find it.
Um,
Exactly.
People don't seem to have trouble finding it. I will say that Steve had one of the biggest contributions to the film, which is near the end. The Americans and the Germans have spent this night together in the cabin, and now they're going their separate ways. And earlier in the film, the American sergeant refused to shake hands with the German lieutenant. And we're shooting this scene, and just everybody's, everybody, you want to get through your shot list. And Steve said, they got to shake hands here. And everybody went, oh, yeah. So we reshot it with the handshake. It's one of the best moments in the movies. And just,
This
if
time
Steve is,
the American offers to shake the
yeah,
hands. We had a really nice cast too. That was one of the fun parts of making the show, is working with these actors. And Rory, you've stayed in touch with some of them.
yeah, yeah. I mean, it's funny. I went back to film school during the pandemic because I don't know why. But I did a short film, and Romano, who's standing up to the right here, I called him up and asked him if he wanted to be in it. So he's in this short film that I did. So
Sure, sure. Well, we've come to the end of our show, but I want both of you to be given the opportunity to tell the audience what you're up to these days. We'll start with Steve. Steve, I know that you've been working very heavily on your latest documentary. Can you talk a little
Yeah,
bit about it?
it's called Working Class Actor, and it's about uh, a character actor named Wings Hauser. And while it's biographical to be sure, it's also a story of what it's like to have an interesting career as an actor in terms of what you want from having a career in acting to the reality of it. He's very, very candid about his ups and downs. You know, he had a pretty fair amount of demons, but he exploded kind of onto the scene for feature audiences in a movie called Vice Squad from, I think it was '83, and he made an impression in that movie, the likes of which Alan Rickman made an impression in Die Hard. Like you go to that movie and you go, who's this guy? You know, and he had the improbable name of Wings Hauser, and then he had this roller coaster ride of a career, and that's certainly part of why we're telling it. But it's also the story of what it's like to be an actor and to have some success, not to have success, to have some fame, not to have enough fame, to sort of uh, it's almost like a primer on what you can maybe expect if you choose this as a life. And I'm very proud of it. And we're about to get into post production and scoring. So hopefully next year we will head out on the festival trail, and people get to see it. And hopefully they'll fall in love with Wings, because again, goes back to that whole thing. You know, interesting characters are interesting to audiences. That and the fact that, you know, I'm doing a lot of commentary tracks for, you know, labels like Kino Lorber and Imprint in Australia, et cetera. And I've done quite a few with Steve. In fact, we're sort of known as the war guys, so much so that when reviewers say commentary by us, they goes, well, of course it's them, you know. So we're kind of a brand, Steve.
Absolutely, and I love that. Rory, what have you been working on lately?
I did some work. So Timothy Chalamet, of course, is coming out in this Bob Dylan movie, and the movie he's shooting, he just finished shooting a movie called Marty Supreme, which is about a famous ping pong player in New York in the early '50s. And they had one scene that was set at Yokota Air Base in Japan. Um, and so I helped on that, and I might be shooting the second half of, or actually it'd be the first half of that scene, but we'll see. And I'm writing a screenplay about the war in Ukraine. So,
And that Japanese sequence, are there any F-86 Sabre jets sitting on the runway?
you know, where we shot, they had an F-84 Thunderjet and a P-80
Wow.
Shooting Stars, but I don't know that if they made it into the film.
Uh,
But you know,
uh,
as we're walking around the location and going, well, you can use that, you can't use that, you can't use X, it's in the wrong color scheme, you know, stuff like that. So
well, gentlemen, this has been great. I do want to say something here to just dedicate this show to the soldiers who gave their lives on our side in the Battle of the Bulge. We had 75,000 casualties in that one battle and a number of dead, tens of thousands or 18,000, whatever it was. And it was a ferocious battle that we eventually won primarily because the weather got better and we could start to use air power again. So I think fondly of those men who made the sacrifice. And thank you both for joining me for this. I think it was a good night.
Oh, my
it
pleasure.
was good to be here.
You've been listening and hopefully watching our YouTube channel, Saturday Night at the Movies. I'm your host, Steve Rubin. Our producer's Ben Shrewsbury. If you like our show, please give us a nod or a comment. I also have a second podcast called Tales from Hollywoodland, where we do different stories as well with my two producing partners, Julian Schlossberg and Arthur Friedman. So we're having a lot of fun with these podcasts. We like to bring history alive. And again, thanks, guys.